Silence was not just a tactic. It was the final, fatal crack in the armor of the Third Reich. On the night of March 22, 1945, General George S. Patton achieved the impossible, defying the ironclad doctrine of the German High Command and rendering their insurmountable Rhine fortress a ghost of its own propaganda. But as the first boats hit the eastern bank, what were the men in the bunker actually saying to each other behind closed doors? The Rhine River was not merely a body of water to the German High Command. It was the psychological backbone of their defensive strategy. For months, the OKW and the leadership of Army Group G had cultivated an image of the Rhine as an impassable barrier. They believed that any Allied attempt to bridge it would require weeks of preparation and massive logistical buildup. This reliance on the Rhine as an insurmountable fortress was the core of their fatal hubris. They ignored the possibility of an opportunistic strike, viewing the river through the lens of static defense rather than fluid maneuver. By banking their entire survival on a geographical feature, they created a fragility that Patton was uniquely prepared to exploit. The German doctrine, rigid and centralized, could not account for a commander who operated with the speed and unpredictability that characterized Patton's career. German field commanders, despite their professional expertise, found themselves trapped in a paradox. Their training favored tactical flexibility and local countermaneuvers. Yet the directives emanating from Berlin, specifically the relentless stand-fast orders, stripped them of their autonomy. These orders, issued directly by the highest levels of the German leadership, demanded that every unit defend its position regardless of tactical feasibility. When frontline officers analyzed the situation at the riverbank, they saw imminent collapse. They requested permission to consolidate forces and pull back to more defensible positions. Berlin, however, perceived these requests as cowardice rather than strategic necessities. This gap between the cold reality of the battlefield meant that when the first U.S. boats touched the eastern bank at Oppenheim, the German defense was already hollowed out from within. The arrival of news regarding the crossing at Oppenheim hit the German First Army headquarters like a physical blow. The initial reports were frantic, disjointed, and lacked the clarity needed to organize an effective response. Officers who received these intelligence dispatches described a sensation of profound confusion. How could the Americans have crossed in such force without a prior artillery bombardment? The silence of the night had been their undoing. The American strategy relied on the principle of surprise, effectively bypassing the reconnaissance efforts that the German command had focused elsewhere. Instead of a massive detected movement, Patton had sent small, agile units to establish a foothold before the alarm could be properly raised. By the time the German command understood the gravity of the situation, the American bridgehead was already expanding. German intelligence, represented by the Abwehr and OKW analysts, had long cataloged Patton as an aggressive, fast-moving adversary. Yet this very reputation became a blind spot. They assumed Patton would strike where the terrain was most favorable, or where the Allied forces had established a significant logistical base. They were looking for the patterns of the past, failing to realize that Patton was iterating in real time. The common misconception that the Germans were always perfectly informed of Allied intentions is dismantled by the chaos of this night. Their failure was not a lack of data, but an inability to interpret the data without the bias of their own defensive expectations. They viewed Patton through the lens of established maneuver warfare, missing the subtle, quiet infiltration that defined the Oppenheim maneuver. The psychological impact on the German soldiers in the trenches was immediate and devastating. For these men, the Rhine was not just a river, it was the final threshold. Hearing the sounds of American engines and the sight of Allied transport boats appearing from the darkness signaled that the last layer of protection had failed. The realization that their leadership had failed to provide the necessary support or tactical latitude deepened the sense of disillusionment. They were standing on the threshold of their homeland, yet they felt abandoned by the strategic decisions made hundreds of miles away. The myth of an unbreakable defense, cultivated for years, dissolved in a single night of tactical maneuvering. The clash between Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's pragmatism and the rigid demands of the command in Berlin serves as a microcosm of the entire war's final months. Von Rundstedt often urged for a more flexible approach, recognizing that once the river was breached, the capacity for organized resistance would vanish. His warnings were consistently ignored or overruled. When he argued for tactical adjustments, The response from the bunker was often a demand for further sacrifice, regardless of the outcome. This disconnect highlights a fundamental strategic failure, the inability to adapt to the speed of the enemy's progress. The German command was effectively fighting a war in the past, while Patton was dictating the pace of the future. If the German command had permitted a strategic withdrawal to the eastern bank earlier, they might have created a more cohesive, albeit temporary, defensive front. This alternate reality, while likely not altering the final outcome, would have significantly changed the scale of the collapse. Instead, by keeping their forces pinned to the west, they ensured that the disintegration of their units was absolute. Patton's gamble at Oppenheim exploited this refusal to yield, turning a potential strategic defense into an opportunity for a rapid, unstoppable breach. The history of the Rhine is often summarized by the size of the forces involved, yet the success of the Third Army was born from the quiet, methodical execution of a movement that the German command had deemed impossible. The logistics of the crossing were masterfully managed. Patton utilized low-profile, rapid deployment boats, avoiding the heavy artillery fire that would have alerted the German positions. The secrecy of the operation was absolute. German frontline units conditioned to watch for heavy armor or massive troop concentrations were caught entirely off guard by the arrival of infantry on their flank. This tactical decision highlights the importance of surprise, even in a theater where technology and intelligence were supposed to render such movements visible. The lesson for historians is clear. Surprise is not about hiding the movement, but about managing the enemy's expectations of where the danger lies. As we analyze the archival records, including the reports from the German First Army, we see a consistent theme of shock. The officers on the ground were writing reports that contradicted the optimistic assessments sent back to Berlin. This dual reality is the defining characteristic of the final months of the conflict. The commanders at the front knew the end was imminent, while the leadership in Berlin continued to operate under the assumption that the tide could still turn. The crossing at Oppenheim was the moment these two realities collided with finality. It was not just a tactical victory, it was the collapse of the narrative that had sustained the German war effort for years. The internal communications between the German commanders highlight the level of frustration experienced by those responsible for the defense. General von Rundstedt's frustration is palpable in his correspondence, where he often noted the impossibility of the demands placed upon him. These leaders were forced to navigate a landscape of impossible orders and limited resources. Their failure to stop the Third Army was not a lack of courage, but a reflection of a system that had lost the ability to process reality. The decision by Patton to ignore the conventional wisdom regarding the Rhine served as a catalyst that accelerated the inevitable end. The role of Patton as a leader who valued speed and initiative is often oversimplified. In reality, he was a student of military history, cognizant of the risks associated with every operation. His choice to cross at Oppenheim was calculated. He understood that the German defensive position, while physically strong, was psychologically and doctrinally rigid. He leveraged this insight to bypass the anticipated fight and move deep into the rear of the German defenses. The success of the Third Army was built on this deep understanding of the enemy's mindset, rather than just sheer military power. As the American troops consolidated their position, the German units were forced to respond to a threat that was already well beyond their defensive line. The rapid expansion of the bridgehead allowed the Third Army to effectively cut off any possibility of a countermaneuver. The speed with which this was accomplished is a testament to the coordination and discipline of the U.S. forces. For the German army, this was the beginning of the end. The Rhine was no longer a shield. It had become an obstacle to their own retreat and a marker of their strategic failure. The intellectual shock that followed the news of the bridgehead reached as far as the Central Command in Berlin. It challenged the core assumption of the Festung Deutschland policy, the realization that an entire army could cross such a major barrier with minimal resistance was a turning point. Historians often debate the precise timeline of the collapse, but the crossing at Oppenheim provides the most accurate marker for when the strategic initiative passed completely into Allied hands. The failure to secure the Rhine was the ultimate testament to the limitations of the German military doctrine at that point in the war. The legacy of this event is defined by the contrast between the preparation of the U.S. Third Army and the paralysis of the German command. It remains a study in the importance of adaptability. While the German forces were capable of localized resistance, They were unable to form a coherent, theater-wide defense. Patton's success was the result of a military philosophy that prioritized maneuver over static defense, a philosophy that proved decisive when the time came to cross the Rhine. The second phase of our analysis moves from the initial shock to the systematic disintegration of the German defense. By March 23rd, the American bridgehead was no longer a fragile foothold. It was a launching pad for the push into the interior. General George S. Patton knew that the key to victory lay in maintaining momentum. He pushed his commanders to expand the bridgehead before the German high command could scrape together any reserve units. This period of rapid advancement defined the final weeks of the war. The German response was hampered by the same fragmentation that had paralyzed them at the onset. Field commanders were receiving contradictory orders, caught between the reality of the American breakthrough and the demands from Berlin to hold impossible positions. The psychological toll on the German soldiers was amplified by the realization that the Rhine, their last natural defensive barrier, had been compromised. Diaries from the period reveal a sense of profound hopelessness. The soldiers saw the American armor moving through the countryside, and they understood that there was nothing left to prevent the inevitable. The internal structure of the German army was crumbling, not just due to the lack of material, but due to the loss of confidence in their leadership. The stand-fast order had become a death sentence for thousands, leading to a climate where soldiers were effectively fighting without hope of victory or even a successful retreat. Patton's aggressive posture kept the German leadership guessing. They struggled to understand his intent. Was this a diversion, or was the main force coming here? By the time they realized that the Oppenheim crossing was the main effort, it was already too late. This uncertainty demonstrates the effectiveness of Patton's approach. He never allowed the enemy to define the battle. Instead, he forced them to react to his movements. This constant pressure was the hallmark of the Third Army. The German intelligence officers, trapped by their own rigid frameworks, could not comprehend that a major offensive could be launched with such a lack of traditional preparation. The decision-making process within the German command was often characterized by personal rivalries. Commanders who were once peers now found themselves competing for favor from the center, often at the expense of their unit's survival. This internal friction, often overlooked in broader historical accounts, was a major factor in the speed of the collapse. When leaders spend more energy protecting their standing than coordinating their defense, the result is inevitable. The American forces, by contrast, operated under a clear, unified command structure that allowed for rapid, decisive action. This difference in leadership culture was a key contributor to the disparity in performance as the Third Army pushed inland. We must consider the role of intelligence in the failure to predict the crossing. German intelligence was focused on the obvious, the concentration of troops and equipment. They were looking for the visual markers of a conventional crossing. Patton, however, used stealth. He moved his infantry across the river in a manner that minimized his profile, proving that even in a highly monitored environment, a bold, unconventional move can succeed. This intellectual shock was not just a failure of the German intelligence apparatus, it was a failure of imagination. They could not conceive of a maneuver that defied the standard manual of operations. The logistical challenge of maintaining a bridgehead over the Rhine was monumental. The U.S. Army engineers worked under intense pressure, constructing floating bridges and ferry systems to move tanks and heavy supplies across the water. The success of this logistical effort was, in many ways, the real victory. It allowed Patton to transition from an infantry infiltration to a full-scale armored push. This transition was seamless, largely because of the foresight of the engineers who had prepared for every contingency. The German forces, unable to disrupt this buildup, were effectively sidelined before they could even attempt a counterattack. The German command's obsession with holding at all costs resulted in the loss of their most experienced divisions. These units, which could have been used to form a flexible defense in the German heartland, were instead destroyed in place. This was a strategic blunder of the highest order. By refusing to allow for tactical withdrawals, the German leadership ensured that their army would be broken piece by piece. This decision-making process was documented by numerous historians who highlight the tragedy of talented officers being forced to sacrifice their troops to satisfy the demands of a detached leadership. The crossing at Oppenheim was not an isolated event. It was the final act of a long, unfolding drama. The preceding months had seen a steady, grinding attrition that had exhausted the German military. The breach of the Rhine was simply the final push that broke the structure. The American success was built on the foundation of constant pressure and a willingness to take risks that the German leadership no longer permitted. The story of this crossing is a story about the intersection of leadership, intelligence, and the brutal reality of wartime decision-making. Looking back, the success of the Third Army serves as a powerful case study in the importance of speed and surprise. Patton's willingness to operate on the edge of conventional doctrine allowed him to achieve what others thought impossible. His leadership, while controversial in its approach, was undeniably effective when the goal was to achieve a decisive breakthrough. The history of the war is filled with leaders who relied on the book. Patton was the commander who wrote his own, especially when the stakes were at their highest. The internal struggles within the German command were, in many ways, just as lethal as the American advance. When officers argue about the direction of the war, the troops on the front line suffer. This lack of unity was the final nail in the coffin for the German defense. The disconnect between the front and the bunker meant that the army was fighting two wars, one against the advancing Allies and one against the impossible expectations of their own leadership. This internal friction was the hidden story of the final days, a factor that is often omitted in more traditional accounts. We often focus on the big names, the generals, the marshals, the leaders. But the success of the crossing at Oppenheim was also the result of the bravery of the individual soldiers who manned the boats and moved through the night. They were the ones who faced the reality of the Rhine without the comfort of their own defensive lines. Their story is one of endurance and determination. Their contribution is the human dimension of this historical event, a dimension that we must always remember when we study the grand strategy of the war. The final push into Germany was a culmination of the lessons learned throughout the war. The importance of logistics, the value of intelligence, and the necessity of leadership that could adapt to the changing realities of the battlefield. The Third Army's crossing of the Rhine remains one of the most compelling examples of these factors in practice. It was a victory not just of force, but of thought and execution. The lessons we learn from this event are as relevant today as they were in 1945. As we conclude this examination, it is important to reflect on the nature of history itself. It is not just a series of dates and names, it is a complex web of decisions, failures, and triumphs. The story of the crossing at Oppenheim is a perfect example of this complexity. By looking closely at the events of that night, we gain a deeper understanding of the factors that shape the course of history. The legacy of the Third Army is not just in the ground they gained, but in the precedent they set. The crossing at the Rhine proved that even the most formidable natural obstacles could be overcome with the right combination of courage and foresight. The events of March 1945 changed the course of the war and laid the foundation for the peace that followed. It remains a story that continues to challenge our understanding of what is possible in the most difficult of circumstances. The crossing at Oppenheim remains one of the most significant maneuvers of the Second World War. It showed that when command and execution are aligned, the impossible can be achieved. As we remember these events, we are reminded of the impact of individual leadership and the fragility of even the most entrenched positions. This story about the Third Army and their bold, silent crossing is a testament to the power of human ingenuity, and it serves as a powerful reminder of how the actions of a few can change the history of many. If you were in command of a defending army and your superiors demanded you hold an impossible line, would you follow orders to the end or prioritize the survival of your men? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.